All right, listeners, strap in, because today we're going to dig deep into the history of marriage.
Yeah,
It's a pretty wild ride when you look back at where it all began.
it really is.
And thanks to the Urantia book, we've got a fascinating roadmap for this deep dive.
Absolutely. It's packed with insights.
So, no more cliches about finding your soulmate. We're talking about the real deal here.
Right. Forget those fairy tales.
The nitty-gritty of why humans first decided to pair up.
And it might surprise you to learn it wasn't about love at first.
Oh, really? Okay, now you've got me intrigued. What were those early couples looking for, if not love?
Survival, plain and simple.
Survival.
Food, protection, making sure their family line continued. Those were the biggies.
So more about practicality than passion, huh?
Exactly. Those early relationships were all about ensuring the survival of the species.
I can see that. Makes sense in a primal kind of way.
And the Urantia book gets pretty real about how this whole survival of the fittest thing impacted women.
Oh, how so?
It wasn't always pretty. You see, back then, women were often seen as property, belonging first to their father and then to their husband.
Wow, that's not exactly the empowering start to marriage I was picturing.
No, not quite a fairy tale beginning.
But I guess we have to look at it in context, right? Times were different.
Exactly. Back then, physical strength was key for survival.
And I'm guessing that put women at a bit of a disadvantage.
It did, and childbearing, while crucial for obvious reasons, was seen as a liability in that constant struggle to stay alive.
So women were stuck between a rock and a hard place.
In a way, yes.
But I have to imagine things started to shift eventually, didn't they?
They did, and you can thank agriculture for that.
Agriculture. How did that change things?
Think about it. When humans went from hunting and gathering to farming, who do you think held the knowledge about plants and crops?
Women, of course.
Exactly. Suddenly, their role as gatherers became essential, giving them a newfound importance.
So wait, the very thing that was initially seen as a disadvantage, needing to tend to crops and children, actually gave them more influence.
That's the irony, isn't it? With agriculture, power shifted to those who controlled the food supply.
And women were at the heart of it.
Absolutely.
Now that's a history lesson I never got in school.
It's a different perspective, for sure.
Completely flips the script on those typical gender roles we imagine with early civilizations.
It challenges those assumptions, which is what makes the Urantia book so fascinating.
Right. It makes you question everything you thought you knew.
Precisely. But it's not all sunshine and roses.
What do you mean?
Well, as societies got more complex, the Urantia book talks about how this desire for, let's say, self-gratification started to influence human relationships.
Self-gratification. Now that sounds a little scandalous for the Stone Age.
Maybe by today's standards, but the book doesn't shy away from the fact that humans have always had desires beyond just survival.
And those desires probably complicated things, didn't they?
You could say that. They added a whole new layer to the evolution of marriage, that's for sure.
So we've gone from basic survival to adding a little, shall we say, spice to the mix.
It seems our ancestors were already getting pretty complex with their relationships.
And I'm guessing those primal urges had a big impact on how marriage evolved.
Oh, absolutely. And the Urantia book doesn't shy away from those details.
Give me the juicy stuff. What kind of details are we talking about?
Well, let's take the whole concept of a bride price, for instance.
Okay, bride price. Sounds a little archaic, doesn't it? Like buying a wife.
It does, but it was more nuanced than that. The Urantia book suggests it was about compensation to the bride's family.
Compensation? For what?
Remember how important those female gatherers and farmers were?
Right. They became essential with the rise of agriculture.
Exactly. So losing a daughter to marriage meant losing a valuable contributor to the family's resources.
So the bride price was a way of acknowledging that contribution.
In a way, yes. It was also about ensuring the legitimacy of any children, which was huge for inheritance rights.
So it tied into those family lines we talked about earlier, making sure things were clear.
Precisely. And here's a curveball for you. If a man couldn't afford the bride price, he could be adopted into the woman's family.
Whoa, really? So it wasn't always about the man holding all the cards?
Not at all. It was about merging families and resources, creating those strong alliances.
It really makes you rethink the whole concept of marriage, doesn't it?
It does. But speaking of shifting dynamics, at some point, this idea of a dowry pops up.
Right, a dowry. That's like the opposite of a bride price, isn't it?
It is, and it reflects a change in the social landscape. As societies evolved, the concept of a wife as property became less acceptable.
At least in theory.
Exactly. And that's when the dowry starts to appear.
So instead of the groom's family paying, The bride's family would give something to the couple.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It was a way of providing for their daughter's future since she wouldn't be directly contributing to her birth family's resources anymore.
A kind of safety net to help them establish their own household.
You got it. And the Urantia book emphasizes that both bride price and dowry, they weren't just about money.
What else were they about then?
They impacted everything. Inheritance rights, the treatment of children, even the social standing of men and women within a community.
It's amazing how these ancient customs reveal so much about these societies.
It's like a window into the past.
And speaking of windows into the past, we can't forget about wedding rituals, can we?
Oh, those are fascinating. So many strange and wonderful traditions.
I've always wondered about those, like where do they even come from?
Well, for early humans, life was full of mystery and danger.
Makes sense.
They couldn't explain everything, so they looked for ways to control the unknown, often through rituals and superstitions.
So wedding rituals, those were serious business back then.
You bet. And some of the ones we find quirky today had much deeper meanings.
Like what? Give me an example.
Take the wedding veil, for instance.
Okay, the veil. Symbol of purity, right?
Well, that's the modern interpretation. The Urantia books suggest it was initially used to disguise the bride.
Disguise her.
Why? To ward off evil spirits so they wouldn't recognize her and curse the marriage.
No way. So it was like a protective shield against supernatural wedding crashers.
Basically. And then there's the tradition of carrying the bride over the threshold.
Oh yeah, classic wedding image.
But guess what? It actually harkens back to a time when wife-stealing was a real thing.
Seriously.
Men literally had to carry their brides away from their families, often by force.
So from abduction to adorable, that's quite the evolution.
It is, and don't even get me started on throwing rice.
Wait, there's a deeper meaning to rice throwing too.
Oh, you bet. Rice was seen as a powerful symbol of fertility and abundance.
Ah, so it's like showering the couple with good luck for a prosperous life together.
Exactly. Every little detail had a purpose, a connection to something bigger.
This is blowing my mind. It makes you realize how much meaning was baked into these traditions.
They offer a glimpse into a time when the line between the natural and the supernatural was blurred.
And rituals were a way of making sense of it all.
Precisely. And while we're on the topic of traditions, the Urantia book throws us a real curveball when it comes to monogamy.
Oh, how so?
Well, it suggests that having multiple wives, polygyny, wasn't always seen as taboo.
Really? That's definitely not the norm in most cultures today.
No, it's not. But the Urantia book argues that in certain contexts, polygyny actually made sense.
I'm listening. Tell me more.
Well, think about societies where men often died young, whether from warfare, dangerous jobs, or simply a lack of health care.
Okay, high mortality rates for men.
Right. Having multiple wives ensured the continuation of a man's lineage and provided for those women and children.
So more of a practical solution than anything else.
Exactly. More wives meant more hands to help with everything. Childcare, farming, just surviving in general.
It was about spreading the responsibility and ensuring everyone was taken care of.
Precisely. And the Urantia book even suggests that in some of those societies, polygyny wasn't viewed as oppressive or inherently unfair.
Interesting. It was just a different way of adapting to the realities of their time.
Exactly. And while the Urantia book is clear that monogamy, one man and one woman, is the ideal.
It acknowledges that there's nuance to these historical practices.
Right, and we have to be careful not to judge the past through a modern lens.
Because even monogamous relationships, while aspirational, come with their own set of challenges.
That's the truth.
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
It does.
And even with all these different ways of approaching marriage, there's something kind of universal about it too.
What do you mean?
Well, it seems like no matter how much societies change, we're still wrestling with the same questions. Love, commitment, how to make relationships last.
Those are timeless questions for sure.
And thankfully, the Urantia book doesn't shy away from tackling those questions head on.
No, it definitely doesn't.
In fact, it issues a pretty stark warning about what it calls the pleasure trap.
The pleasure trap.
Yeah, it sounds a little ominous, doesn't it?
It does, a bit.
So, what is this pleasure trap, and what does it have to do with marriage today?
Well, the book talks about how our modern world is all about instant gratification.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, who doesn't enjoy a little pleasure?
Of course, but the Urantia book argues that constantly chasing pleasure can distract us from something bigger.
Like what?
The deeper, more enduring values that make for a strong marriage. Things like commitment, patience, putting in the work even when it's hard.
So it's about finding a balance.
Exactly. It's not about denying ourselves pleasure, but making sure it doesn't come at the expense of everything else.
It makes sense. But that's got to be tough in today's world.
How so?
We're bombarded with messages that happiness is just a click or a purchase away.
It's easy to fall into that trap, for sure.
So how do we avoid it? Does the Urantia book offer any guidance?
It does. It stresses the importance of self-awareness, being honest with ourselves about what truly brings us joy.
And recognizing when we've crossed that line from enjoyment to indulgence.
Precisely. And it also highlights the importance of finding meaning and purpose beyond the material world.
So cultivating our spiritual side.
Exactly. Connecting to something larger than ourselves, it can give us a stronger foundation for making choices that support our relationships, not just our desires.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's about aligning our actions with our values, both individually and as couples.
Which is really what the Urantia book is all about, isn't it?
In many ways, yes. It encourages us to think critically, to question our assumptions, and to strive for something greater.
And it reminds us that marriage, with all its complexities and challenges, is ultimately a reflection of who we are as human beings.
And who we aspire to be.
Well said. It's been quite a journey exploring the past, present, and future of marriage through the lens of the Urantia book.
It really has.
And I have to say, it's given me a whole new perspective on this ancient and ever-evolving institution.
Me too.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, keep those conversations going, keep exploring. And until next time, take care.